I see. And what's your research topic, Shani? Mental health. Okay, mental health is your research topic. Okay, great, great, great to see you. Welcome both of you. So let's see whether we have friends on the YouTube live chat as well. So I can see 3 people waiting. I guess they can only get to the part when because we are a little bit ahead of time. We have 7 more minutes to go before we go live. So just if you have any questions, how are you guys finding these sessions? Just let us know your comments. Hi, Rochana, great to see you. Let us know what, from where you are, which university or which organization, and what is your research interest. So is there, it's interesting how I can, is there a connection? And I'm always on the lookout of how one person research interest can be somehow aligned with the other person's research interest, and I feel like probably there can be good, interesting topic on how diabetes might be linked up with mental health. Probably, I don't know whether that can be a research topic for somebody or not. Rachana, would love to know about a little bit about you. I think Rachana is coming in and out. I guess there's some issues. Okay, so so as I was saying that this episode is at its end, and sorry, the series, and if you want to look at what happened in the previous series, you can go and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just for those people who are still not aware of the YouTube channel, here's the channel link for all of you. So this is the channel link, and there's this whole series. We actually did 3 different series so far. One is about how to get new ideas. So that was the first series. Then we had a second series on how to write your paper. And then we had this third series, which is ongoing. And today is the last episode of that, and how to get to the results. So we pretty much try to cover all the different things that would be concerning you and bothering you. And if you want to know a little bit more about what are the previous episodes of this series, then you can go to YouTube and you can later on watch them. Just to brief you, the first episode number 1, was designing the experiments. Episode number 2 was more about the methodologies. Episode number 3, which was last week, and that was more about analyzing your findings. And then episode number 4, which is tonight, and it is about drafting or writing about your findings, right? So let's see. I hope there will be some other people coming in who have registered, and because we are still 3 minutes to go, and let's just wait for some more people to join in. Otherwise, we will go live and let people come in. Any questions specifically to me, Khadija, Shani? You can ask me whatever knowledge I have. I would be very happy to give you the answers. If you want to put some question for the general public, there's a button called Ask a Question, and you can put your questions over there. And I will be watching that, so that if you have any questions, I will get to them. Other people can also answer those questions, right? All right. So great. Yeah, me too. I'm excited. Hmm, let's see if there's some more people. For those people who are still to find us on Discord, where we are gathering a really good, nice researcher community, where we try to help each other out in broader aspects of how to do research, the very specific aspects also. We try to figure out how seniors can help juniors, and so that juniors don't make the same mistakes which the seniors did. So this is the link for those people who want to contribute over there. I would highly request and recommend you to be there. And there are really nice, useful materials that we keep sharing with each other. Okay, I guess it's almost time, and we are going to. So I will be sharing my screen, and in the meantime, if you have any questions, all of you just put them on the chat. Or yeah, so here we go. Let me share my screen. All right, I hope my screen is visible. Somebody who can help me out in letting me know if my screen is visible or not. Okay, great, great. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to yet another session episode of Research with me. And for those people who don't know, we are doing this series on called Getting to the Results. And tonight is the last episode of that. So it's the volume number 4. And what we are going to talk about tonight is how to write about your findings, right? So the first episode was, as I said, was on designing your experiments. The second episode was more about the method, how to go about, and it's primarily we discussed all sorts of biases that can creep into your research methodology in terms of your experiments. And then episode number 3 was more on how to analyze the findings, how to interpret the findings, and what are the things that you have to be careful about while interpreting the findings. And then tonight, how to write about your findings. So that's kind of the sequel, right? So for those people who don't know me, I'm Professor Sarish Dasgupta. I'm a professor at this university, tech university called DAIICT, that's in the western part of India. And I also happen to be the founder and CEO of Rax. For the initiators who don't know, Rax it's a next generation literature analysis and comprehension tool, which helps you to easily dissect and analyze a paper properly, to quickly compare and contrast how one paper is related to the other paper, and to quickly understand a paper, getting all the resources on the fly, and to see what are the different dimensions that constitutes a paper. If you want to play more with it, you can actually go to this site, Raxter.io, and play with it. So I always thought I've made up my mind to start this particular series with this slide, which is that, and this is so true, that your research career is all about how good your results are. And that's the reality. And by results, you can say whatever is the result in the sense of it depends upon your discipline, but results can be results that come out of your experiments, or it can come out of other kind of qualitative research methods that you might be doing. Whatever is your finding, if your findings are not supporting your claim, well, that's the end of the story, right? So you really need to make sure that you get good results and the results can be used to support your claim, right? So this is kind of like the overview or the template, and you start with a research question and you have a research claim. You claim something about that question while you are trying to address the question, and the way you will be addressing the question is the research method or the approach, right? And if you dig deeper down, and this is the zone, where we are delving in, last episode and this episode is going to be this second layer where, when you are starting with a research approach or research method and you follow that and you find some research findings, then you see, you take that finding and you start analyzing and interpreting the findings, which was episode number 3, last episode. And then after that, you use that to support your claim, right? And one integral part of supporting your claim is the publication, which means when you come to this stage, the last stage, that's the time when you would be thinking about writing a paper or and publishing it in a very good journal or a very good conference proceeding, right? So tonight's discussion is more about that drafting process, right? Now we have to understand that this is something that we definitely don't want. So this is this is what we have to be very careful about. As you can see in this cartoon, that you have Cecilia, who is, by the way, Cecilia is a character of PhD Comics, and I really love PhD Comics. So I know by this time, everybody who knows me knows that how much of an aficionado I am. So anyway, so you see, Cecilia is coming out with her first draft, got rejected, second draft, got rejected, and every time she's revising, and then finally draft number infinity, and again so many corrections, and then finally the professor says, "I'm sick of reading this, just turn it in." Now this is not what is the ideal scenario, and when it comes to writing about your findings, which actually is the key thing when it comes to a paper getting accepted, right? And you have to be very careful about this, right? So tonight's discussion is all about how to avoid this. So I took this slide from one of my previous discussions that I had way back when I was doing this series on how to actually write your paper. So there is a whole series on how to write your paper. And over there, I discussed this concept of mise en place. And the idea of mise en place is that, as you have, people who know French, the French culinary style. And over there, what happens is that every French chef, what they do is that before they start the cooking process, they actually have all the ingredients and all the prep work done and all, kind of organized on the chef's table. And then they start the cooking. And this is exactly how it should happen when you are writing. And before writing, you need to make sure that all the supporting evidences are ready. And there are a certain few checklists that I would want to discuss when it comes to writing about your findings, right? And the checklists are, the very first one is, are all the arguments that you are using, are they backed with authentic and authoritative facts? So authentic is one thing and authoritative is another thing. So authentic means that, the sources are true or genuine. And authoritative means that the sources carry a lot of weight, a lot of credentials, right? And if something is coming from that particular source, then people take it with a lot more importance, right? So this is the first thing. The second thing that you need to be careful about, even before you start writing, is have you done the right kind of sampling? That's very important. If you are doing some sort of a sampling, if you're gathering, if even before you do this study, you would be selecting your sample selection. So first of all, there should not be any bias during the sample selection, and I discussed at length about such biases in episode number 2 of this series, and you need to make sure that you don't have them, right? And is done, if it is a time interval based sampling requirement, then it is done that way properly. Then the third thing is that are the experiments done with the appropriate controlled environment, right? So many times you have to run your experiment within a particular controlled environment, and when you do the controlled environment, you actually, the entire purpose of controlled environment is such that there isn't any false conclusion, or there isn't any bias in the way you are going to conclude, right? So that is again, I discussed control environment at length in my previous episodes of this series. But and if you want, I would highly recommend you at this point to later on go to those episodes and have a look at them. Uh, the fourth one is you need to make sure that the method that you're using for coming out with the results, and or the analysis that the way you are analyzing those results or the findings, that's acceptable in your own research community. Which means if you are coming out with a particular method which is not really accepted, then it's not going to work, because even if you report it in that way, most likely it will be rejected. So you really need to make sure that the approach you are using, or the method or the technique or the measures you are using to investigate your findings, to analyze your findings, to get some conclusions out of your findings, are standard and acceptable, right? And then finally, last but one, are you getting the acceptable precision? So whatever precision or whatever results, that you should make sure that that's something that is significant, that's something that is interesting, that's something that is going to create enough curiosity to the reviewer, and the reviewer would be, it's something to be put on the plate. Let's put it that way. So you need to make sure that your results, the accuracy of your results or the precisions of your result is quite good, right? And then finally, if you're using figures and tables, you need to make them all ready before you even actually start. This is so important. This is so important. Before you start your writing process, you need to make sure that all your figures and all your tables are all ready. You need to make sure which figures you're going to include, which tables you're going to include. And I'm going to talk about more about figures and tables in the last part of tonight's discussion. But you need to make sure that they are all ready. And then finally, it's not just about having them ready, but you need to make sure that they are truly, and truly is very important, they are truly supporting the claim, your claim, right? So that's sort of the what I call as the mise en place, which is that you have to make sure that your checklists are all okay before you even proceed with writing, right? So this is extremely important. Which means, and when you do this, if you do this, you can write better, because you have everything in place. You have a structured frame of mind, right? And that will help you a lot in writing with a lot more clarity, right? So don't do this. Don't start writing and then again go back into the labs and do some experiments and again start the writing. So this is not the right approach for writing about your findings, Okay, so I'm only talking about writing about the findings section right now. So any question regarding mise en plan, this slide, let's just stick to this slide for now. Any questions on this slide? Otherwise, I'm going to move ahead. Let's see if there are questions. Hi, Mohammed. Great to see you. It's my pleasure to see, how we can actually help researchers, and that's something that I'm very passionate about, and that's why I do it. I would love to know what you are working on. I guess you have attended before, if I remember you, but I don't remember your research interest. So yeah, it would be really nice to know about that. And if you have any questions, anybody having any questions so far regarding what I just discussed over here, the mise en plan. How many people face this issue? Just put a thumbs up. This slide, all these things happen. How many people, just put a thumbs up. How many people face this problem, which is depicted in this cartoon? Hello, Dr. Samir. Nice to see you. Would love to know what you're working on and from where you are. Okay, all right. Let me just go ahead. Okay. In the meantime, you just keep putting your thumbs up or thumbs down if you have this, if you ever face this. I used to face this quite a lot, actually, when I was a PhD student. So so now, yeah. So today, the entire point is to talk about blueprints, right? Which means when you're, and the very first thing I want to tell you is that when you start writing about your finding, don't just start writing like that. Just first put the blueprint. First prepare the blueprint, which means prepare the skeleton sort of what will be the sections, what will be the subsections, what will be the content of each section and each subsection in bullet points. What exactly you are going to do, and this is what I'm going to discuss tonight. Because ultimately what you're going to write is depending upon what your research interest is, or what your research question is. But the structure, I'm going to talk more about the structure tonight, right? So before I go into that, and it goes back to the first episode when I said that when we talk about experiments, when we talk about findings, when we talk about results, we are actually talking about two different types of experiments, or two different purposes rather, not types, but two different purposes of experiment. So the first purpose is and you can run experiments, you can do experiments for any one of these two purposes, or maybe both. So the first kind of experiment is when the approach itself is an experiment. So you have to first ask yourself, is your approach experimental? If that is yes, then you are in type 1. Then the style of writing is going to be quite different, as opposed to type 2, which means that when you are actually running an experiment to evaluate or to validate your approach, right? So these are the two different things. These are two different things. One is that you are actually running the experiment, which is the approach itself. And the second thing is you are running the experiment to validate the approach or to evaluate the approach, which means how good the approach is, right? So let's look into the first one. So what is it? It's actually an empirical way of establishing the claim. And the claim is essentially the statement, the final conclusions or set of conclusions that you are going to lay upon or establish as your original contribution. So the claim has to be original, right, and impactful. So whatever you're claiming when you are taking up a research question, and you will be finally coming up with the claim. Um, so you need, and to get to that claim, the approach is to do some experiments. So that's what type 1 is. So over here, if you are doing that, then while you are writing, this is the question that you have to be bothered about. This is the question that you have to be very careful of, and this is the question that you are actually addressing while you are writing that particular section, which is what? Have you laid out each steps of the experiment in a very clear way? Or have you described each steps of the experiment in a very clear way? And you have to do that in terms of these three things. First, you have to lay out what is the input of every step. So so there is something called the process, and the process constitutes a set of steps, like step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and that's what would constitute process. And then there can be another process, again that process. So if you look at every experiment, it's actually a sequence of processes. And if you zoom into every process, it's actually a sequence of steps, right? And if you look at a process as a whole, so a process, in order to run the process, in order to execute the process, you need input. And there can be three different ways of looking into input, or three different types of input, so to say. It can be materials that you would be needing, some certain materials that you would need to run the process, or it can be the data sets that you would be needing to run the process, or it can be some sample. For sample studies, you need to select some samples, you need to carve out some samples to do the process, right? So you need to be very, very clearly describing your input, your process, and then each process will have an outcome or an output. And the output can be intermediary or final, depending upon whether the process is an intermediary process or the final process, right? So if I have to put it hierarchically, so there is the entire experiment, there is an experiment. Under the experiment, you have the different processes laid out in sequence, and under each process, you have the different steps laid out in sequence, right? And by output, there can be three things. Either you're analyzing the outcome of the process, and by when I say either or, I mean it can be both, right? It can be all of these three. So, or you are trying to conclude something about the process or the outcome of the process, or you are trying to infer something from that output, right? And it's interesting why it is a sequence, because one process leads to the other process. So the output of one process would become the input of the other process. But definitely there can be some additional input to the other process, together with the output as an input coming from the previous process, right? So this is how it would be. And when you are laying it out from a writing structure, this sequence should come out very, very clearly. I'm going to talk more about that in the next slides, but this is what you have to be careful about, that this is the agenda. This is the goal of the entire write-up. These three are the agenda of the entire write-up when you are looking at experiments as an approach. But if you are looking at experiment as an evaluation of your approach, which means that you are now running some experiment to empirically test your approach. How good is your approach? And you have to show to your reviewer and to the larger scientific community that your approach, and then hence the claim that you are making because of that approach, is the approach itself is really sound and really solid and robust and has certain kind of rigor, right? And has very strong foundation. And that's where you have to through certain experiments, you have to show that the approach is really good. Now, the question that if you are doing that, then the question that should bother you, and this is essentially the crux of that entire piece of writing that you would be doing for type number 2, is have you explained the observations with respect to your approach? That's the question that you are actually trying to answer in that entire write-up, right? And what I mean by that, there are three different aspects to it. The very first question, or sub-questions rather, the very first question is, what aspects of the evaluation needs to be evaluated? So this is something that or rather, this is a typo. What aspects of the approach rather needs to be evaluated, which means that when you are trying to figure out whether the approach is good, bad, ugly, you are actually figuring out, it's a multi-dimensional question. You are actually trying to figure it out from multiple different perspectives, or multiple different dimensions, or multiple different aspects. So by aspects, what I mean is the perspective or the dimension on the lens that you will be putting on when you are trying to figure out whether the approach, or whether when you are trying to establish that your approach is actually good, right? So you need to make sure that you choose those perspectives really well, because if you don't choose those perspectives really well, then the reviewers are going to question it. You will be under the critical, under critical examination of your reviewer, and in a larger, to the larger extent, to the entire research community, right? So setting the goals of your evaluation is going to be crucial. That's the first thing that you need to do. The second thing that you need to do is you need to be clear before writing how will you observe that particular dimension, or that particular aspect, or that particular perspective. How are you going to observe it, right? So that is the setting the experiment, or how will you run that experiment? How will you get to that observation, right? And the third thing is, how will you evaluate what you are observing? So for every aspect or for every dimension or perspective, you have observed certain things, you got some findings. Now, how are you going to evaluate it? What would be your measure? So setting the measures of observation. How will you evaluate it, right? So these are the three things that you have to make sure you do when you are, if you are doing type 2, which is if you're running an experiment to evaluate your approach, right? And you can actually do both. You have your approach is an experiment, but at the same time, it's an experiment over how good was the experiment. So it's a meta experiment. You can actually do that as well, depending upon your research topic, depending upon your research community, because it also depends a lot on the research community, actually, because a lot of research community would want you to do certain things in certain way, right? So there may be a good number of research community, your research community would actually expect you to also do type 2. And if they expect it, you should do it, right? So let's see if we get some more questions at this point in terms of these two categories or whatever we have discussed so far. If you have questions, just put it out there. Great, you're from Palestine. Great, you're in. So, Dr. Samir, I hope I am pronouncing your name correctly, Samir. Okay, I have. Okay, you have more than 35 published articles and book chapters. That's really good. That's really impressive. So let's. If you have questions for me, or if you have questions for each other, then just put it out there. So far, whatever we have discussed. Let me check out my YouTube friends. If you have any questions, just put it out there. Somehow I feel like if there are no questions, then I somehow feel that, oh, I had so many questions when I was in your at your stage, and I somehow feel that probably I was so stupid and you guys are so intelligent. Okay, so any if there isn't any question, then I will move on. Okay, let me move on. Okay, there goes one question from Pipit. Hi, Pipit. Hope you're doing great. How to present the mixed method findings? Yeah. So this is a very, very good question, actually. And can I take this question in the next slide? Because I'm going to talk about the presentation part over there, but definitely. And why don't you do something? Let me just copy this and put it as a question, actually, for everybody. And let's see. People can answer that put comments over there, and let me finish off with the presentation, and then with the next slide, and then I will definitely get into this one. Okay, so here we go. So now let's start with the type number one, which is my approach is experimental, right? And how do we go about this in terms of the blueprint? How do we present it? Okay, so if my approach is experimental, and by experimental, what I mean is that it can be a mixed, in a mixed sense, it is experimental, because it can be a mix of qualitative experiments, or it can be a mix of qualitative and quantitative experiments. By qualitative experiments, what I mean is that surveys, questionnaires, interviews, focus group discussions, clinical or rather participant of and non-participant observations, and so on and so forth, right? So case studies, right? So these are the qualitative methods, and quantitative methods would be more what happens in STEM research, like more of lab experiments or simulations, or more to do with, let's say, clinical trials and so on and so forth. And those are more quantitative methods. And then there can be a mix of both. So some aspect of it you do qualitatively, while some aspect of it you do quantitatively, right? Now, but then the ultimate goal is what? The ultimate goal is to run the experiment so as to address your research question, right? So the outline, the very first thing I would recommend a lot is that you should come up with the outline section before you even go into the details. You need to have an outline section of the approach. And the point of that outline section is, imagine that I'm reading your paper. I'm reading that particular manuscript. Or imagine that I am the reviewer of that manuscript. And I've decided that I will not read any of the follow-up sections. I'm not going to read any of your follow-up questions. I'm going to make a decision on the basis of your outline section. Let's just take, and it doesn't happen that way, but let's just take that as a consideration. Then, can I read this outline section and get an overall understanding of the entire approach from end to end? And if I am able to do that, then you have written a really, really good outline section. So the entire point of an outline section is to set the context clear. Like, what is the approach? And this approach can be a mixed approach, can be qualitative, can be purely quantitative, but what is that approach, right? And what would be the outline then? The outline would be an outline of all the follow-up sections, right? So if you look at the follow-up sections, what is it? It's actually a sequence of processes, right? And when I say processes, I want to again emphasize over here that it's not steps. Steps are different than processes. So a process is a logical unit of which comprises of multiple steps that you take. So let's see that a process has an objective. A process has a goal. You do that process with a very specific target goal to achieve something. It has a milestone tagged with it. But steps are the tactical things, like, I first did this, and then I did this, and then I did this, and then I got to this. So each process will have its own step, right? And when I say follow-up sections, then you have to do it this way, that I would recommend you to do it this way, that you make every process a section, right? And then you lay out the sections in terms of how they are sequentially arranged in the way you actually did that experiment, right? Now, if it is qualitative experiment, let's say you are conducting a survey or something, then the survey is just it's actually the means to that process. So let's say there is a process, and to do that process, to run the process, you needed to do some surveys. Now the steps would be how you actually, all the nitty-gritties of how you designed the survey and how you got the responses, and how you and so on and so forth, and how you analyzed it and all, right? So so this is what I want to tell you, that whether it is a case study, whether it is a survey, whether it is an interview, or whether it is something which is more quantitative and more on the quantitative side, you are essentially having a process, and that's the start. How you do that process is essentially whether it can be either qualitative, or it can be quantitative, or it can be a mix of both, every process. So the writing style that I would suggest you is not to think of it more from qualitative versus quantitative point of view, but to think of it more from the process point of view. What does this process collectively need? What is the best way to do this process? Let's put it that way. And it can be purely qualitative, it can be purely quantitative, or it can be a mix. And you have to write it more from the process point of view, right? And every section or every process, in that sense, you have to put it more like in each section. When you zoom into every section, now how does a section look like? And it can also comprise of subsections, but I rather like this, and many reviewers like this idea of peeling the onion, or top-down approach, where what happens is your step one would be something like where you clearly define what is the goal of that process, or why you are even doing that process, why the process even exists, what you are trying to achieve with that process. So that particular process, which is corresponding to that particular section, you should clarify it right in the beginning of the section. What is the goal of the process? Then the next thing to do, the next best thing is to actually clearly say what is the input. And by input, as I said, like, it can be materials used, it can be the data sets used, it can be the it can be the samples that you have selected, and so on. So what is input? You need to describe the input very clearly. Where did you get it from? Why did you choose that source? How did you make sure that there isn't any bias? And what is the nature of that particular input in terms of its distribution, if it is a data set, and so on and so forth, which actually would matter, which is relevant to that process, right? Don't just describe every single little detail which is not even relevant, right? So you don't have to describe everything. So then step 3 is what is the output, which is the outcome of that process. And you have to be very clear over there, because that is where people will judge you the most. Like, in the sense that, have you clearly described the output, right? And then the step number 4 is, why, you have to now give an interpretation to it, an analysis of it. And what is the analysis? The entire point of an analysis is you need to convince me as a reader and a reviewer that why is that output interesting, right? And if you are not able to answer that question, I've seen many people making this mistake of they completely bypass step number 4. They just end the section over here. What is the output? That's it. And they don't talk about why this output is interesting. Why are you even talking about this output? Why does it even matter? Why is it even coming in this paper, right? So you need to make sure that you are actually doing step number 4 really good, right? So this is something that I would recommend as a blueprint when you are doing the type number 1, which is when your approach is experimental, right? And how to write that out, right? So by the way, when I just want to make sure that the question that I got from Pipit, has this been answered properly, Pipit? Or did I get the when you said mixed method? Did you mean the mix up of qualitative and quantitative methods? Or okay. So, and did I was I good at explaining it? Yeah. That's what I guessed. I hope I clarified it. Otherwise, I can try. I can make another attempt. And if you have don't just hold back, right? If you have more queries, then just put it in. Or if you want more clarification, just let me know. Okay. So Shiny has a question. Can you give an example on writing an outline section? An example, a good example would be. Let me see. Okay, I will give. When I show you, maybe I can show you a little bit of how you can do things in Rax. And I have some really good papers over there, which I kept there, and I can show you one example of how to write an outline section. But then, usually the problem with giving examples, Shani, is because, I might give an example which is more into computer science, whereas you might not be able to relate to an example properly. So I usually I'm kind of like, I'm very wary about giving specific examples in my sessions, because I feel the moment I give examples, it's become so discipline specific. But anyway, I will still try. Any other question? No, John, we don't give certificates. This is purely a giveaway, so to say, from Wax Labs, and we just do it because we want to help our researchers out there, and there's no certificate associated with it. So if you really feel this is useful to you, then please do come. But then don't come for certificates. We don't do that. We have certificate programs sometimes when it is arranged, when we do a webinar specifically in collaboration with the university. But then it's up to the university. It's actually the university who organizes those certificates and all. So we are not part of that. Okay, so let's go to the next part of it. So now imagine that you're the other kind, the type 2, right? And the problem with type 2 is, like, my approach needs evaluation now. And it comes with, I found this interesting, very interesting and very true, actually, situation that we all come up with. And why the approach needs evaluation is because of this situation. As you can see, Cecilia comes in and to her advisor, and the advisor would be like, research can be frustrating. Sorry, I got the name wrong. It's Tajel. So then, and what as you can see, I don't know how many people are aware of this Greek mythological figure called Sisyphus, and it's almost like the Sisyphus is, this keep on pushing this heavy boulder up and up and up, and I sometimes feel that we are all doing that. It's an uphill, really, really steep uphill climb. Research is all about that, and you're pushing this heavy thing, and then at the end of the day, the Sisyphus' thesis advisor almost would be like, you know what, let's go up a different way. And this is something that happens a lot when you are actually going on with an approach and you're not evaluating it while you are going on with that approach. And then you suddenly, at the end, when it is too late almost, you have done a lot of work, and then you feel like, well, it's not really leading to anywhere. So it's always a good idea that even when you're taking those small things, when you're having, like, let's say you're done with your first step, then your second step, you always internally also have a mechanism of evaluating it, right? Now, when you come to the final stage and you are about to write your manuscript, and if this is what you are going to write, which means now you're actually writing about your experiments, and your experiment is actually an evaluation of your approach, then the goal is very different. Then the goal is to run experiments to support the approach. And if you are able to support the approach, eventually, basically, you're supporting the claim as well, right? So, or it gives a lot more strength to the claim, right? It makes the claim a lot more believable, right? So, acceptable. So that's the goal. Now, there are 4 parts to it. And the first part, when you start writing, my recommendation would be to set the evaluation goal clear. And what do I mean by that? The very first thing you should start, there should be like a section which only talks about these 3 points. In point number 1, within point number 1, these 3 points. And what is that? And in these 3, and these 3 points can very well be like subsections or paragraphs or whatever that is. But this is how you should begin. You should begin with what are the aspects or dimensions or perspectives of the approach that needs to be evaluated. You make it first very clear right in the beginning. You make that very crisp and clear that this is the aspect of the approach. So these are the dimensions of the approach that I am interested in evaluating. And then you have to make it very clear, because this is so important. It's not just good enough to say that this is how I'm going to look into my approach. You have to make it very clear why those aspects or why those dimensions or why those perspectives matter. Because if you are not doing that, your reviewer is not going to be convinced. Your reader will not be able to get himself or herself convinced about it. So you need to make sure that A, you have gotten all the right aspects in, and B, you have not gotten the wrong aspects in. So you don't include those aspects and dimensions that actually do not matter at all. And you do include all those aspects and dimensions that actually matter. And by matter, what does it mean? They actually will be, because you are, at the end of the day, what are you doing? You're trying to evaluate the goodness of the approach. Good, bad, ugly, what is it? But good, bad, ugly with respect to a certain aspect. And if you are choosing the irrelevant aspects, then it doesn't matter even if it is good. If it comes out to be good, people will question it, because people will tell you that, well, this dimension or this perspective doesn't make sense or is not important. So it doesn't. So even if you get good results, good findings, and show that, wow, this aspect looks so good, still people are not going to be convinced. So your first point of convincement, so to say, your first point where you have to convince me is that whatever aspects you picked out, whatever dimensions you picked up are really, really relevant, are really, really good, right? Then comes the third thing, which is what input. And that, again, that input can be from a data set point of view, from a samples which you are studying point of view, from a materials point of view. So what input is required to observe the aspect? This question. So these are the 3 questions that you should have clear-cut answer to when you're writing this first section number 1, right? So you have to address these 3 questions in the first section. Then comes the second section. And in that section, the entire point is to define all the different evaluation measures with respect to each goal, which means that what qualitative, quantitative, mix of both, what kind of measure you're going to use to figure out the goodness of the aspects. Like, it's not just good enough to say that, oh, this is good. Why? How did you know? What metric did you use? What metric did, like as an example, let's say Likert scale is a very, a very popular metric for survey studies and for questionnaires, right? So in the same way, in computer science, especially in machine learning, goodness measure would be in terms of which is goodness means accuracy in machine learning, right? And in machine learning, goodness is measured in terms of precision, in terms of recall, right? In terms of the confusion matrix or precision recall, F1 score, whatever that is. So there are all these different measures that are if you're we do summarization. So one way of doing measuring summaries is Rouge, and Rouge is so essentially it can be very well possible that you find certain issues with the measures that are standard, but you have to make sure that you use certain standard measures that are accepted by your research community. And if you are not willing to use those measures simply because you find flaws in them, then that itself can be a research question, but that should be a separate discussion altogether, and you can write a separate paper on it, actually. But don't mix up these two things. Don't try to because people get confused a lot that what exactly is your research question. So don't come to this section and then try to define a new research question. Don't do that. I mean, that's so confusing. Then people will completely get confused. And it's not a well-written paper if you do that, right? So stick to the measure that's known to the community. If you have questions about those measures, then you create a whole new paper out of it, and then you show one by one with proofs and other analysis, mathematical analysis or whatever that is, and why those measures are flawed, right? So that can be a whole project, and then subsequently a whole paper of its own. Finally, the third thing, which is after that, the third section should be you describe the experimental setup, which means the question that you're trying to answer in that section is how will you observe the aspects? How will you observe those dimensions? How will you observe those perspectives? And over here, what are you essentially going to write about? The tools, the instruments, the process that you are using in order to get to these observations or the findings. Then finally, the final section is you explain the process or the method. And there are two aspects to it, two things that you have to do over here. Step number one, the first thing, you start that with the first thing is that you have to detail out the observations themselves, right? A detailed description of the observations. And over here, you will have figures, you will have to reference your tables and your images as and when applicable, right? And then step two is, for every single such detailing of a particular observation, you need to have an analysis or a conclusion or an inference in order to support the approach, because the ultimate goal is to support the approach. So don't forget that, because this is what type number two is. So you have to, so step number two is actually the most important thing. You are doing all these things, all the 4 steps, because of this final thing. You have to now provide support to the approach, right? So before I jump into Rax, and let me see how much time do I have. Okay, I have some time. Before I jump to Rax and show you with an example, there are certain style issues that I want to kind of warn you with, and I call them the anti-styles. And the very first thing I want to warn, which I also discussed in my series on how to write a good paper, how to write the best paper. So the first thing that you need to do is beware of forward references. And what are forward references? A lot of time when I review papers and I see this thing happening a lot, like, I read a particular section and I don't understand the section, and and the author tells me that you want to understand this, well, keep reading. So essentially, and then which means that I have to go to the next page or the next page to understand what I am reading now, and that's so confusing, and that's not good reading. It's not a good flow, right? So avoid forward references in your section, which means that let's say that you're writing section number 3 and you're like, okay, you want to understand this section, then you better read section number 5. That's what is forward reference. Don't do forward references, right? Avoid it as much as possible. And one way to avoid it is to make sure that you actually do the outline, you do it in a very top-down manner, so that, and the details should come later on, right? The second thing is table and figure captions or titles that you're using inside the figure or the table, or the legends that you're using inside the table or the figure. I have seen a lot of time, the problem is that they just talk about briefly, they just talk about what has been observed, and this is what it is, and this is, we found this. But no, don't do that. The way the titles, the captions, and all the other things that you're using, the way it has to be done is that you should reflect these 3 things. Number 1, what is the aspect of the approach that is getting observed in that table or in that figure or in that image? What is that particular aspect of the approach that you are that's getting observed here? The second thing, what is the goal of the observations? That is the goodness. What aspect, what are you trying to observe in terms of the goal, not in terms of the figures, the numbers of the data, but why are you even observing it? Why are you even observing it, right? And the third thing is, what measure has been used to understand the goodness? These 3 things should somehow reflect on either the caption or the title or the legends or all of it. These 3 things should sum it up in terms of when you are actually placing the table, or when you're placing the figure, or when you're placing the image. They should come out very, very clearly, because as a reader, a lot of times readers and a lot of times reviewers, and more specifically reviewers, they immediately go to your figures and tables to understand what you have done. And if your figures and tables, the only way you understand what you have done, and what am I seeking when I immediately go to your figures and tables? I'm actually seeking these 3 things. And if I go to any figure or table, and if I don't get information about these 3 things, I learn nothing really properly. So that is something that has to be very understood, very, very well. Okay, so now let's see if there are some more questions. Otherwise, I will just go to some example. Hi, Vidya, how are you? Okay, so let's go to Rax, and I'll show you. So for those people who are yet to find out what Rax is, this is the website. And let me just log in. And let me open maybe one of my projects. So this is the research projects, where you actually have all your research projects organized, and you can start your own research, create your research project by clicking over here, putting your title and all. And some of these projects you can do also in collaboration. Some of the projects you can do in solo mode. So let me just open up one project that I'm working on. And when you are opening up a project, this is the structure of Rax, because Rax is essentially primarily a literature survey analysis tool, which helps you to critically examine all these papers, which are your reading list, sort of, and you can upload your reading list from all these different places, from your computer, as PDF URL, from other reference managers, or also from, if you are more used to Google Drive, then you can do it from Google subscribe as well. Now, let's see if I can give one example. Let me take one of my papers. It's not because it's my paper and I am claiming that I wrote a very good paper, but it's actually got published in one of the top tier one conferences in computer science, PCAP. And let's see if I can give you one example of an outline. Okay, so this is the paper, and if you open it up, by the way, this is beside the point, but then you get all these related papers related to the key aspects of this particular paper. So let's look into this paper, and let me see. So you start with the introduction as usual. You go to the related work as usual. You explain what exactly is the problem, and then over here you have the approach, and these are the processes of the approach, and then let me look into the evaluation. Okay, so here you go. So you see that there are two ways in which I am evaluating the approach. One is how good it is to compute document similarity. So this is the first thing. Okay, how good is it to compute a document similarity? The other thing is how good is it to compute document clustering, right? So I am trying to understand what I'm trying to understand the approach, and the approach is basically this. This is my approach, and I'm trying to understand the approach on the basis of two different lens or two different perspectives. One is document similarity, and one is document clustering. And this is what I wrote over here. Let me just make it larger. Yeah. So I made it very clear over here that there are two ways in which I'm going to evaluate, right? Then within each, what did I do? I first talked about, we first, I mean, I shouldn't say I, we first talked about the evaluation setup and the data set, which means that how exactly are we going to observe document similarity, and what data sets are we going to use, right? And what is the evaluation goal? What are we exactly trying to, which means that how are we going to evaluate whether it is a good thing or a bad thing, whether the approach really is working or not, right? So this, I wrote this very clearly over here. So you see that anybody, and then after that, the results and the analysis, right? And over here, I talk about the result, and I also talk about the analysis. By the way, this is a conference paper, so it's not very, very detailed as what you would expect in a journal paper. So you see that the evaluation setup what is the goal of the evaluation. So it's all written over here, what exactly is going to be the goal, which also is summed up over here, right? And how are we even going to, uh, conduct the experiment is written over here, and then the results and the analysis. In a very similar way, if you look at it, again, the evaluation setup and data set, or the other way of looking into the problem, and how we are going to evaluate the approach in terms of what kind of data sets we are going to use. So these are all the different data sets that has been used. Evaluation goal, what exactly is the evaluation goal, and results and analysis, right? So, and then we also look in the evaluation goal, we will talk about the measures, what kind of measures we are using to evaluate it, right? In terms of what, like let's say precision, recall, F score. Over here, in terms of, again, for this one also, we did the same thing. We measure in terms of, so it's very clear in terms of what are we going to measure, right? So in terms of these things like Jacquard index, leucine index, copy, DM25, and so on, right? So So yeah, so and then finally there is some extended analysis which you can also give as an extension, sort of say. So it's kind of like a conclusion of, it's a sum up. What else can you conclude after you put on these two lenses, and then what extensions you can have. So that's what kind of extension can you do? Can you make? What extra additional insight do you have for the reader? That's given over here, right? So you see, this is one structure, but as I said, like overall, it is following what I told you over here, and in tonight's discussion. And there are multiple other. The best way to figure out is to actually go to the top journals in your research area and to pick up those papers which are heavily cited, and then to look into it, and then try to look into how what I said and how they match, like how much of their style is going with my style. And in general, the how to write a paper, please do visit those episodes where we talk about how to write a paper, for not just the findings but for everything, end to end, right? Any questions so far? Else we are to wrap up this tonight's session, and we are to wrap up this episode. And by the way, I want to tell you something, that first of all, I hope that everybody reaches this state. This is, by the way, this is Cecilia, that was Tajin. So this is what I hope and I wish that everybody should be looking forward to, and it comes as soon as possible in your life. And this ecstatic state where he submits all the reviews, all the results, all the data, all the analysis, all the findings, and the professor is happy and says that, yeah, you are ready to graduate. Right? We don't know what we are going to do next Wednesday, whether we are going to do next Wednesday. So topics, suggestions. So for suggestions, what you have to do is you go to Discord, join Discord, and you keep giving me suggestions on Discord. So just to give you the link again. So this is the Discord link. I guess it won't let me send it again. Okay, all right. So any questions? Any questions or departing questions or anything? Let's say okay, this is just a command to understand. This is something from Shiny. Understand from the example. Outline section is first to get themes and thereafter sub themes. Yes. Outline section again is to answer, or rather, let's look at it this way, Shiny. Do you have the answer to this question in the outline section? Which means if I only read this section, will I be able to get the overall idea of your approach? Will I be able to, and I don't read anything else, but I will still be able to talk about your approach and tell somebody else that, hey, Shiny has a really interesting approach and that's quite unique. So the uniqueness should come out of it also, right? So that's it. So it's actually a sum up of all the subsequent sections. Okay, all right, great. Any more questions? I don't think so. Okay, so here we wrap up, and please do give your suggestions as to what are the topics that you would like me to cover, and a very safe. Keep yourself very safe. Keep your family very safe, and a very good night. Bye bye.